All right, then. So we're now in day 6 of what Russian authorities are formally describing as a special military operation in eastern Ukraine. Now, to date, the UN estimates at least 600,000 people have been displaced in this conflict, and it is casting a very long shadow across economies here on the continent in various ways. It's driven up the prices of key food imports like wheat and sunflower oil, and it's also driven up the prices of energy as well. So let's examine the latest developments on this conflict on the economic side. Charlie Robertson is the chief economist at Renaissance Capital. He joins us now live on the program. Charlie, good to see you here. So let's start with a problem that's likely facing wheat importers, for example, in Egypt. If you're looking for a way to buy your wheat supplies from Russia, or you're looking to buy spares for Russian-made jets, helicopters, tanks, APCs, that sort of thing, they need to make these payments to a Russian bank. But what sort of payment problems are they likely to be running into?
Well, firstly, they don't necessarily have to use a Russian bank. They could use Italian bank, French-owned bank, which are operating still, Dutch bank, which I used to work at actually, ING, that are all operating still in Moscow. So there are foreign banks there. There's also unsanctioned Russian private sector banks that are there too. So the banking system, there is parts of the banking system that are not sanctioned. And then there's some currencies that are not sanctioned. So the US is making it very difficult to use the dollar if you're Sberbank, if you're VTB, which are two of the biggest Russian state banks, which have been sanctioned. But for other banks, it shouldn't be a problem. It's a little like Iran. In 2012 to about 2016, for 4 years, Iran was sanctioned. But there was still two-way trade with Iran, including from many African countries in Iran. And so it gets a little bit slower. It gets a little bit more in the way of paperwork because you can't use SWIFT for some of the banks. But trade will still happen without electronic messaging.
But isn't the other factor here, at least to use the Iran example as a counterpoint here, with Iran, at least the unknowns, for lack of a better word, were relatively clear. The conflict wasn't going to escalate. Here, the unknown is what happens if you wake up tomorrow morning and the US and the UK or the EU have decided to ratchet up sanctions even further. If we have an escalation of the SWIFT cutoff, for example, doesn't that essentially provide an incentive for a lot of these banks to just say, well, we don't want to deal with the risk here, so we're not going to touch any transactions dealing with Russian products that are being exported out of the country?
Well, but as I said, there are still Russian private sector banks that exist. Tinkoff, for example, is been a big kind of fintech type bank, which has done extremely well over the last 10, 15 years. And that still exists. And they are going to be happy to get into trade finance if that's where there's some profit to be made. Now, in terms of whether people want to buy Russian wheat or Russian gas, well, we just had Pakistan's Prime Minister in Moscow today signing a deal to buy millions of tons of wheat, grain, and more Russian gas. So people want those products, and Russia still has an awful lot of them to supply.
Russia's oil and gas haven't been touched so far, but if Western Europe were to try and replace those supplies from Russia, how would they be able to do it? Where would those supplies come from? And is such a switch feasible this year?
It would be a redirection. If you remember the US sanctions and trade war with China, what happened there was, I think it was Brazilian soybeans ended up being sold to America because they weren't buying Chinese soybeans or something. So what it used to be was Chinese beans or something to America, and then it became Brazilian beans to America instead. It just gets redirected. So if Europe stops buying Russian oil, they'll buy more oil from Nigeria, which is currently selling it to China. So then Russia will be selling its oil to China instead of to Europe. If it comes to gas, that's a different story because there isn't the global supply available via LNG, for example. There just isn't enough tankers. There isn't enough ships to supply the gas that Europe would need. So you can imagine some small cutoff in Russian gas supply to Germany, although Germany's got a contract to buy Russian gas until 2024. In fact, that gas is running through Ukraine today. today, Russia's just paid Ukraine $3 million, and they do that every day, $1 billion a year, to supply Russian gas across Ukraine's territory to Germany. So Germany is kind of contract bound to buy that. But if somehow they could cut that contract, well, then I imagine some German households will be a bit colder.
Is that the sort of pain, though, that the EU would be willing to inflict on its own citizens in order to essentially bring this conflict to a halt, to tell the Russian authorities, look, you've gone too far, you've got to essentially roll your tanks back across the border?
Well, we've modelled a kind of a 25 or 50% cut in Russian gas supplies, or say 100% for 3 months. And it would knock Russian GDP even more deeply into recession for a few years, for this year. But Putin, I'm not sure that that's going to put Putin off. He's still got $200 billion of reserves, even after the foreign reserves have been frozen in the States and Europe. And those reserves at the moment are still growing by $1 billion a day. Well, the current account surplus is $1 billion a day as Russia's exporting more than it imports. So base case is Russia would still take the hit until it's finished what it's trying to achieve in Ukraine, which may be over in a few weeks, largely over.
Okay, so one last question for you, Charlie. After the seizure of Crimea back in 2014, Russia spent a fair bit of time selling down some of the assets held by the government. US Treasury holdings, for example, cut down to virtually nothing. It's not even in the top 30 holders at the moment. But do we know what the private sector exposure of Western firms to Russian assets is like, and how can they sell it in the current environment?
Well, it's a struggle, and the Russian Prime Minister today just said no one's allowed to. You're not allowed to sell your assets in Russia. BP, it seems, they're saying BP can't sell the 20% of Rosneft, Russia's biggest oil company, that it announced just a day or two ago it plans to sell, and it's written down that $25 billion investment. Shell has just said it wants to sell its investments in Russia. And Russia actually on Monday morning just turned around and said no foreign portfolio investors owning shares or bonds in Russia are allowed to sell them either. So at the moment, Russia's trapped that money inside Russia, I think as a counter-sanction to the US, Europe, and everybody else who's sanctioned Russian reserves that are held abroad. So at the moment, it's very messy, and it's going to be very hard to get investors to look again at Russia in the medium term. As a result of what's happened in the last few days.
It does raise that ultimate question. Even if you were selling, who would be able to buy? Who would want to buy?
Well, the question came up after 2014, and the assumption was China might, that China might want to get more involved. But it didn't put a huge amount of money in, actually, in 2016, 17, which was the last time I was checking those figures in detail. China's been quite cautious, happy to buy the raw materials, not so happy to put in some long-term investment into the economy.